In this section, we will take a step-by-step look at the process of winemaking and the decisions a winemaker must make in order to create the wine they so desire. The basic process for making wine is quite simple. Step 1. Pick a large amount of ripe grapes. Step 2. Put grapes in a clean, leak-proof container. Step 3. Crush the grapes to release their juice. Step 4. Wait. Clearly, modern quality winemaking is a bit more intricate than just that, and it is in the small details of the process and the choices made by the winemaker at each step that make each wine unique and interesting. New World and Old World winemakers tend to have philosophically different approaches to winemaking. In the Old World approach, terroir is paramount. The winemaker should allow the wine to express nature's qualities as closely as possible with minimal manipulation in the winery. The New World approach, on the other hand, allow the grapes to be the raw materials to be molded through human artistry and technology. The winemaker/artist can employ any of the technical means at their disposal to make a wine that bears their personal stamp. The process for producing white wine is the foundation for all other winemaking. Red wine, sparkling wine, and fortified wine production are all variations or extensions of the white wine making process. So that seems to be the logical place to start. Wine production can be broken down into 3 primary phases: crush, fermentation, and maturation. Once the grape grower and winemaker decide that the grapes in the vineyards have reached optimal ripeness, the grapes are picked and carefully transported to the winery. Everything that happens from the time the grapes reach the winery until fermentation is initiated is referred to as crush. Once the grapes arrive, the first step is sorting the usable grapes from any debris that may have also been collected during harvest. The grapes often come straight off the trucks to the sorting table, where rocks, leaves, bugs, subpar berries, etc. are removed. Rigor of sorting varies. Higher quality wines are more particular about what makes it through the sorting stage. While no one wants damaged fruit or foreign debris to enter the winemaking process, thorough sorting is timely and costly. The more rigorous the sorting, the more costly the production, and ultimately those costs will show themselves in the price of the finished wine. From the sorting table, the grapes go through crushing and destemming. The grapes are sent through a machine designed to break open the berries and remove the stem structure from the grape clusters. Once the berries have been broken, they become susceptible to oxidation and fermentation, so some winemakers choose to eliminate this step for white wine production, preferring whole berry or whole cluster pressing. The next step in the process is pressing. Grapes go from the sorter and destemmer to the press. The press is the machine that separates the juice from the grape solids. Movement from the vineyard to the press, especially if grapes have been through a crusher, has caused some grapes to already burst. So when the grapes are put into the press, a large amount of juice drains out immediately. This is called free-run juice. Free-run juice is considered the best, most pure juice the grapes have to offer. It is highest in sugar and acid, and because it has spent little to no time in contact with the skins, seeds, and such, it has not picked up any potential bitterness from tannins or other phenolic compounds. Approximately 60 to 70% of the juice within the grape is free-run juice and can be released without any use of the press. After the free-run juice is collected, the grapes are subjected to 1 or more pressings to extract the remaining juice. Each subsequent pressing requires more pressure to extract the juice, and the resulting juice has spent more time in contact with the skins and seeds, resulting in more and harsher tannins and other phenolic compounds that may or may not be desirable in the finished wine. For this reason, the batches of juice from each pressing are kept separate for the winemaker to later blend or discard at his discretion. There are many types of presses that exude pressure on the berries to extract juice in different ways. These run the gamut from rudimentary foot stomping a la I Love Lucy to very high-tech modern machinery and everything in between. One of the most common presses used by quality wineries today is the bladder press. In the center of the bladder press is a balloon that fills with water or air. As the balloon fills and takes up more and more room within the press, the juice is pressed out through perforated openings. This is a gentler type of pressing that is less likely to crush seeds or burst open skin cells, resulting in more juice with less tannin extraction. Once all the desired juice has been extracted, a cake of skins and seeds remains. This is called pumice. It is often plowed back into the vineyards as fertilizer, or sometimes it is distilled to make spirits like marc or grappa. So far we've taken the grapes from the vineyard and made grape juice. This pre-fermented juice is referred to as the must. Before the must undergoes fermentation, the winemaker has the opportunity to make adjustments if needed that will impact the style and quality of the wine to be made. One such adjustment is chaptalization. Chaptalization is the addition of sugar to the must to increase the potential alcohol in the finished wine. This is typically done in very cold climates where the grapes fail to reach full ripeness. Without enough sugar going into the fermentation process, the winemaker runs the risk of not being able to produce enough alcohol to create a balanced wine, or in some cases, enough alcohol for the finished product to be considered wine at all. The opposite adjustment of chaptalization is acidification. Acidification is the addition of acid to the must. This is typically done in overly warm climates or in very hot years when not enough acid remains at harvest due to respiration. Acidification is usually done with tartaric acid as to not affect the flavor of the wine significantly. It is important to note that must adjustments are generally reserved for extreme situations. In some winemaking regions they are even banned. Next, the must is allowed to settle. The French call this débergage. This is the chance for solids to settle out of the must so there will be less sediment post-fermentation. And if any adjustments were made to the must, this time allows them to integrate with the juice. Now is when winemaking gets really tricky. As long as there is sugar, like there is in grape juice, and there is yeast, which is naturally found on the grape skins and in the ambient winery environment, there will be fermentation. Fermentation can take place anywhere and is actually more difficult to prevent than it is to initiate. It is the task of the winemaker to control and direct fermentation to create the desired wine. In order to prevent spontaneous premature fermentation, the winemaker has a couple tools at her disposal: sulfur dioxide and refrigeration. Both sulfur dioxide and cool temperatures inhibit yeast activity, thereby preventing unwanted fermentation. When the winemaker is ready to initiate fermentation, the must is inoculated with yeast. This is another decision point for the winemaker. Are cultured or native yeast used? Cultured yeasts are commercially grown and known to be effective at making wine. Different strains are cultivated and chosen for desirable flavors and aromas in the finished wine. The biggest advantage of cultured yeast is their predictability. In the case of native yeasts, on the other hand, yeast cells and spores are everywhere, in the air, on the grapes, and in the winery. If good strains of yeast are dominant in the winery, the indigenous yeast can be allowed to conduct fermentation rather than inoculating with a cultured yeast. Some winemakers feel that the use of native yeast helps contribute to the unique expression of terroir of the wine. But compared to the cultured yeast, these ambient yeasts hold more potential risk. They could incite an unpredictable fermentation, resulting in the presence of off flavors and aromas and higher volatile acidity. Also, there is a potential risk for a stuck fermentation if the indigenous yeast strains are not vigorous enough to fully convert all the sugars into alcohol. Once fermentation is initiated, yeast cells consume the grape sugars, creating alcohol. They also start reproducing and multiplying. As this is happening, the must begins to bubble and foam from the resulting carbon dioxide, and the temperatures begin to rise. As the temperature rises, the yeast become more active. They consume more sugars, create more alcohol, more carbon dioxide, and more heat, and they multiply more rapidly, which just continues to perpetuate the cycle. It is easy for a fermentation to get out of control. Regulating temperature is absolutely crucial during fermentation. One reason is that certain temperatures affect the flavors and aromas of the resulting wine. Cool temperatures are best for retaining delicate fruit and floral aromas of white wines, and as temperatures rise, the flavors become more neutral or sometimes even cooked. Also, if temperatures get above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast cells will die and fermentation will stop prematurely. Various kinds of cooling techniques and devices are available to the winemaker to prevent this from happening. In ancient Bordeaux, they placed the fermentation vat atop blocks of ice. Today, wineries are set up with sophisticated fermentation tanks that have built-in cooling rings or cooling jackets that go around the outside of the tank with temperature gauges and alarms throughout the winery. Under ideal conditions, with proper temperature control and healthy yeast, fermentation should continue for as long as it is necessary for the yeast to consume all of the available sugar. This process can take several days to several weeks. Typically at the end of fermentation, the resulting wine contains 12 to 14% alcohol with no residual sugar. However, winemakers can always choose to stop fermentation early, leaving some residual sugar in the finished wine for either balance, desired taste, or preferred style. After fermentation is complete, the winemaker is faced with many decisions to determine the style of his wine and how to prepare it for bottling and eventual sale. One such decision is whether or not to encourage malolactic fermentation. This process can take place either during or after the primary fermentation. In malolactic fermentation, lactic bacteria is added to the wine to convert the tart, sharp malic acids into softer, rounder lactic acids. This process almost always occurs in red wine production, but is a stylistic choice for white wine producers. The practice is most often used for Chardonnay and bigger white wines to capture those luxurious, soft flavors. Allowing the wine to remain in contact with the lees is another stylistic choice faced by winemakers. After fermentation, the dead yeast cells settle to the bottom of the tank or barrel. This sediment is known as lees. As the dead yeast cells break down in a process called autolysis, they release compounds that influence the flavor and texture of the wine. White wines with extended lees contact develop more complex, less overtly fruity flavors and a richer mouthfeel than they would otherwise. If this influence is not desired, as for wines that want to show off their fresh primary fruit and floral character, the wine is immediately racked off the lees. If the winemaker does want the influences of the lees, the wine is allowed to remain on the lees, either in barrel, tank, or bottle, for an extended amount of time. This is known as sur-lee aging. To amplify the influences of the lees further, the winemaker can stir the lees, causing them to come into contact with more of the wine, thus imparting more flavor. The French call this lee stirring batonnage. To age or not to age? That is an important stylistic question for winemakers. Time and oxygen have a softening effect on a wine. In order to maintain their freshness and exuberance, many white wines are not aged significantly before bottling and release. For those that are aged, the question of oak arises. Oak aging vessels allow for a slow oxidation that changes the wine and adds complexity. Slight evaporation through the porous wood concentrates and intensifies the flavors and aromas. Oxidation softens tannins. And the oak itself imparts flavor into the wine. Vanillin, a phenol found in oak, can give the wine a sweet vanilla flavor. The degree of toast or char a barrel receives can also impart varying degrees of toasty or even caramel flavors into the wine. The degree to which the winemaker desires these characteristics in his wine will determine the aging regime he employs. The final stylistic decisions are made in the blending process. The winemaker composes her final wine by blending finished wines from different lots. These various lots could contain wine made from grapes from different vineyard sites, or even grapes of different varieties. They could also contain wines that went through different aging regimes. The goal is to achieve that perfect balance and flavor the winemaker desires. Especially in the case of white wines, consumers expect their wine to be clear and bright. Before a wine is bottled or set aside to age, it goes through a series of clarification processes in order to accomplish two objectives: clarification and microbial stabilization. In clarification, large particles that affect the visual appearance of the wine are removed. In microbial stabilization, organisms that affect the stability of the wine are removed, therefore reducing the likelihood of re-fermentation or spoilage. Racking is the easiest and least intrusive of the clarification processes. Suspended solids are simply allowed to settle to the bottom of the vessel, and then the wine is carefully poured off into another vessel. Several rackings may be conducted over time, resulting in clearer and brighter wine. Fining is a process in which an inert material is stirred into the wine to bind with unwanted particles and then settle out. Being inert, these materials do not change the flavor or structure of the wine. Gelatin, egg whites, and bentonite clay are commonly used in the fining process. Filtering traps particles over a certain size as the wine is strained through a barrier with fine openings. Various size filters can be used depending on the size of the particles to be removed. Sterile filtration can remove particles as small as microbes, which could cause spoilage, but some believe there is the risk of removing flavor molecules as well. Cold stabilization is the process by which potential tartrate crystals are removed from the wine. Wines with large amounts of tartaric acid could potentially develop crystals on the underside of the cork or in the bottom of the wine bottle. In order to prevent this, they are chilled to 25 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 3 weeks and then racked so that the tartrate crystals do not end up in the finished wine. Once the wine is aged, blended, clarified, and stabilized, it is ready to be bottled and released to the consuming public. The basic steps for making red wine are the same as those for making white, with just some tweaks to execution. The alterations mostly center around skin contact. Since skins are the means by which wines receive much of their flavor, structure, and color, when white wine production shies away from skin contact, red wine production embraces it and even enhances it. This section will not go step by step through the winemaking process again, but instead will highlight the places it varies from white wine production. The first example of how this difference plays out is in the crushing and destemming process. While crushing is optional for white wines, it is absolutely imperative for reds. Because in making red wine, the pressing does not occur until after fermentation, the red grapes must be crushed first in order for the yeast to be able to reach the juice inside the grapes during fermentation. After crushing, the must goes through a period of maceration, which can happen before and during fermentation. Allowing the must to be in contact with the grape skins gives the color, tannin, and flavor components the opportunity to leach into the wine. Maceration can last for a few days to a few weeks, depending on the style of wine the winemaker is going for. Long macerations yield highly extracted wines with deep color, high tannin levels, and big flavors. Shorter macerations yield softer, more accessible wines. If a winemaker chooses to begin maceration before fermentation, the must is chilled to prevent premature fermentation with the wild yeast found on the skins or in the winery. This is called a cold soak. During fermentation, phenolic extraction is amplified and expedited due to the rising alcohol and temperature levels. Cap management is absolutely crucial during red wine fermentation. Carbon dioxide produced during fermentation will cause the cap, which is the compact mass of grape skins and seeds, to float to the top of the fermentation vessel. If the cap is allowed to stay at the top of the tank, then only the wine at the very top is coming in contact with the skins and receiving the phenolic goodness, and the wine will not fully develop the flavor, color, or structure desired. Also, if the cap were to stick at the top of the tank and the carbon dioxide was not allowed to escape, the winemaker could have a very explosive situation on his hands. There are several different methods for managing the cap: punching down, pumping over, rack and return, and rotofermentation. In punching down, the winemaker physically pushes the cap back into the juice. This can be done several times a day. In pumping over, the juice from the bottom of the tank is pumped out and sprayed over the top of the cap. Concerns of aeration and oxidation can arise with this type of cap management. Rack and return, also known as délestage, is when the juice is strained into separate holding tanks and then returned to the original tank by pouring it over the sunken cap. This is considered by many winemakers to be the gentlest of the cap management options. And then there's rotofermentation. This technique employs a specialized fermentation vessel that either rotates on its own or contains an inner paddle that mixes the fermenting must, allowing the juice to stay in constant contact with the skins. Red wine fermentation typically takes place at higher temperatures than fermentation for white wines, as light floral and primary fruit flavors are less important and more phenolics are extracted at higher temperatures. Red wines that are lighter and more fragrant in style, like Pinot Noir wines, are typically fermented at 60 to 70 degrees. Big, bold, tannic red wines, like Cabernet Sauvignon, require a higher fermentation temperature, typically 85 to 95 degrees. Winemakers face a precarious balancing act with these higher fermentation temperatures, though. While higher temperatures increase phenolic extraction, they get dangerously close to cooking their yeasts and ending up with a stuck or incomplete fermentation. After fermentation ends, the winemaker may decide to extend the maceration. For fullest phenolic extraction, maceration may continue for several weeks after fermentation ends. Once the wine has achieved desired phenolic levels, the free-run juice is racked off the solids and the remaining cap is pressed. The resulting wine is very rich in color and tannin. Like for white wines, the pressed and free-run juices are often kept separate and then blended at a later stage for proper flavor and balance. Red wines, like white wines, may be fined and filtered. However, this will likely remove some of the phenolics as well, so it is not as common in red wine production as it is in white. Aging, often in oak, is important for all but the freshest and most youthful of red wines. The slow infusion of oxygen into the wine through the oak aids in polymerization, a process in which tannin molecules combine to create longer chains and so softer, richer-feeling tannins. New oak barrels also impart vanilla and toast aromas and flavors into the wine, which many find favorable. However, oak barrels, especially new barrels, are expensive. They can add up to $5 to the cost to every resulting bottle. The making of rosé wines is a hybrid of red and white wine production. It begins as a red wine. Red grapes are crushed to allow the juice to begin extracting color and flavor from the skins. Once enough color has been extracted to turn the must a pretty pink, the juice is separated from the solids, and winemaking then continues as if for a white wine. And those are the steps and decisions a winemaker must make to take the raw grapes from the vineyard and turn them into an enjoyable bottle of white, red, or rosé wine.